Daddy and did the slide needed headed holy lead.
Who's that over there?
Huey. Daddy.
Very good. Who am I?
Huey.
Who am I? Hey, who am I?
Human.
Yeah, who am I?
Human.
Welcome to the MasterMind Library. I am. They call me Ferdinand, the bringer of balance, leader of many disciplines, and your host of the MasterMind Library.
No. La baby and Daddy and Dicky.
Well, Sincere had to go to gymnastics, so she's not going to be with us today. Well, today we have made it to episode 101 of the MasterMind Library, and we are going to be completing the first chapter of Simulacra and Simulation. So bear with me, y'all. Put this over like this. Yeah, that works. Worked out real well. Okay. What's that, Trey?
Library.
You like the MasterMind Library, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, while you're talking to the crowd, I'm going to go ahead and move to where we need to go to in the book, okay?
And if I watched it.
What's that?
Library.
Yeah, okay.
And library and did the slide and then whole library.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. All right, cool. Thank you for that. All right, now let's find where we're supposed to be in the book real quick, and then we can get started. Yeah, say hi to our audience out there.
Daddy of the library, Daddy, and Mommy, Daddy.
All right, that's where we're supposed to be right here, Trey. All right, so let's make this a little bit larger for everybody, and then we'll get started. Okay. The pleasure of an excess of meaning when the bar of the sign falls below the usual waterline of meaning. The non-signifier is exalted by the camera angle. There one sees what the real never was, but as if you were there, without the distance that gives us perspectival space and depth vision, but more real than nature. Pleasure in the microscopic simulation that allows the real to pass into the hyperreal. This is also somewhat the case in porno, which is fascinating more on a metaphysical than on a sexual level. Besides, this family was already hyperreal by the very nature of its selection. A typical ideal American family. California home, 3 garages, 5 children, assured social and professional status, decorative housewife, upper middle class standing. In a way, it is this statistical perfection that dooms it to death. Ideal heroine of the American way of life. It is, as in ancient sacrifices, chosen in order to be glorified and to die beneath the flames of the medium, a modern fatum, because heavenly fire no longer falls on corrupted cities. It is the camera lens that, like a laser, comes to pierce lived reality in order to put it to death. The Louds, simply a family who agreed to deliver themselves into the hands of television and to die by it, the director will say. Thus, it is a question of a sacrificial process, of a sacrificial spectacle offered to 20 million Americans, the liturgical drama of a mass society. TV verite, a term admirable in its ambiguity. Does it refer to the truth of the family or to the truth of TV? In fact, It is the truth that it is the TV that is the truth of the louds. It is TV that is true. It is TV that renders true. Truth that is no longer the reflexive truth of the mirror, nor the perspectival truth of the panoptic system and of the gaze, but the manipulative truth of the test that sounds out and interrogates, of the laser that touches and pierces, of computer cards that retain your preferred sequences, of the genetic code that controls your combinations, of cells that inform your sensory universe. It is to this truth that the Loud family was subjected by the medium of TV, and in this sense it amounts to a death sentence. But is it still a question of truth? End of the panoptic system. The eye of TV is no longer the source of an absolute gaze, and the ideal of control is no longer that of transparency. This still presupposes an objective space, that of the Renaissance, and the omnipotence of the despotic gaze. It is still, if not a system of confinement, at least a system of mapping, more subtly, but always externally, playing on the opposition of seeing and being seen, even if the panoptic focal point may be blind. Something else in regard to the louds. You no longer watch TV. It is TV that watches you live. Or again, you are no longer listening to Don't Panic. It is Don't Panic that is listening to you. A switch from the panoptic system, from the panoptic mechanism of surveillance, discipline, and punish. Surveiller et punir, to a system of deterrence in which the distinction between the passive and the active is abolished. There is no longer any imperative of submission to the model or to the gaze. You are the model. You are the majority. Such is the watershed of a hyperreal sociality in which the real is confused with the model, as in the statistical operation or with the medium, as in the louds operation, such as the last stage of the social relation, ours, which is no longer one of persuasion, the classical age of propaganda, of ideology, of publicity, etc., but one of deterrence. You are information. You are the social. You are the event. You are the involved. You have the word, etc. An about face through which it becomes impossible to locate one instance of the model, of power, of the gaze, of the medium itself, because you are always already on the other side. No more subject, no more focal point, no more center or periphery, pure flexion or circular inflexion. No more violence or surveillance, only information, secret virulence, chain reaction, slow implosion, and simulacra of spaces in which the effect of the real again comes into play. We are witnessing the end of perspectival and panoptic space, which remains a moral hypothesis bound up with all the classical analyses on the objective essence of power, and thus to the very abolition of the spectacular. Television, for example, in the case of the louds, is no longer a spectacular medium. We are no longer in the society of the spectacle, of which the situationists spoke, nor in the specific kinds of alienation and repression that it implied. The medium itself is no longer identifiable as such, and the confusion of the medium and the message, McLuhan, is the first great formula of this new era. There is no longer a medium in the literal sense. It is now intangible, diffused, and diffracted in the real, and one can no longer even say that the medium is altered by it. Such a blending, such a viral, endemic, chronic, alarming presence of the medium, without the possibility of isolating the effects, spectralized, like these advertising laser sculptures in the empty space of the event filtered by the medium. Disillusion of TV in life, disillusion of life in TV, indiscernible chemical solution. We are all louds doomed not to invasion, to pressure, to violence and blackmail by the media and the models, but to their induction, to their infiltration, to their illegible violence. But one must watch out for the negative turn that discourse imposes. It is a question neither of disease nor of a viral infection. One must think instead of the media as if they were in outer orbit, a kind of genetic code that directs the mutation of the real into the hyperreal, just as the other micromolecular code controls the passage from a representative sphere of meaning to the genetic one of the program signal. It is the whole traditional world of causality that is in question. The perspectival deterministic mode, the active critical mode, the analytic mode, the distinction between cause and effect, between active and passive, between subject and object, between the end and the means. It is in this sense that one can say TV is watching us. TV alienates us. TV manipulates us. TV informs us. In all this, one remains dependent on the analytical conception of the media, on an external active and effective agent, on perspectival information with the horizon of the real and of meaning as the vanishing point. Now one must conceive of TV along the lines of DNA as an effect in which the opposing poles of determination vanish, according to a nuclear contraction, retraction of the old polar schema that always maintained a minimal distance between cause and effect, between subject and object, precisely the distance of meaning, the gap, the difference, the smallest possible gap, PPEP, irreducible under pain of reabsorption into the aleatory and indeterminate process whose discourse can no longer account for it, because it is itself a determined order. It is this gap that vanishes in the process of genetic coding, in which indeterminacy is not so much a question of molecular randomness as of the abolition, pure and simple, of the relation. In the process of molecular control, which goes from the DNA nucleus to that substance that it informs, there is no longer the transversal of an effect, of an energy, of a determination, of a message, order, signal, impulse, message. All of these attempt to render the thing intelligible to us, but by analogy, retranscribing in terms of inscription, of a vector, of decoding, a dimension of which we know nothing. It is no longer even a dimension, or perhaps it is the fourth, which is dinned, however, in Einsteinian relativity by the absorption of the distinct poles of space and time. In fact, this whole process can only be understood in its negative form. Nothing separates one pole from another anymore, the beginning from the end. There is a kind of contraction of one over the other, a fantastic telescoping, a collapse of the two traditional poles into each other, implosion, an absorption of the radiating mode of causality, of the differential mode of determination, with its positive and negative charge, an implosion of meaning. That is where simulation begins. Everywhere, in no matter what domain, political, biological, psychological, mediatized, in which the distinction between these two poles can no longer be maintained. One enters into simulation, and thus into absolute manipulation, not into passivity, but into the differentiation of the active and the passive. DNA realizes this aleatory reduction at the level of living matter. Television, in the case of the Louds, also reaches this indefinite limit in which, vis-a-vis TV, they are neither more nor less active or passive than a living substance is vis-a-vis its molecular code. Here and there, a single nebula whose simple elements are indecipherable, whose truth is indecipherable, the orbital and the nuclear, the apotheosis of simulation, the nuclear. However, the balance of terror is never anything but the spectacular slope of a system of deterrence that has insinuated itself from the inside into all the cracks of daily life. Nuclear suspension only serves to seal the trivialized system of deterrence that is at the heart of the media, of the violence without consequences that reigns throughout the world, of the aleatory apparatus of all the choices that are made for us. The most insignificant of our behaviors is regulated by the neutralized, indifferent, equivalent signs, by zero sum signs like those that regulate the strategy of games. But the true equation is elsewhere, and the unknown is precisely that variable of simulation which makes of the atomic arsenal itself a hyperreal form, a simulacrum that dominates everything and reduces all ground level events to being nothing but ephemeral scenarios, transforming the life left us into survival, into a stake without stakes, not even into a life insurance policy, into a policy that already has no value. It is not the direct threat of atomic destruction that paralyzes our lives. It is the deterrence that gives them leukemia. And this deterrence comes from that fact that even the real atomic clash is precluded like the eventuality of the real in a system of signs. The whole world pretends to believe in the reality of this threat. This is understandable on the part of the military. The gravity of their exercise and the discourse of their strategy are at stake. But it is precisely at this level that there are no strategic stakes. The whole originality of the situation lies in the improbability of destruction. Deterrence precludes war, the archaic violence of expanding systems. Deterrence itself is the neutral, implosive violence of metastable systems or systems in involution. There is no longer a subject of deterrence, nor an adversary, nor a strategy. It is a planetary structure of the annihilation of stakes. Atomic war, like the Trojan War, will not take place. The risk of nuclear annihilation only serves as a pretext through the sophistication of weapons, a sophistication that surpasses any possible objective to such an extent that it is itself a symptom of nullity. For installing a universal security system, a universal lockup and control system whose deterrent effect is not at all aimed at an atomic clash, which was never in question, except without a doubt in the very initial stages of the Cold War, when one still confused the nuclear apparatus with conventional war, but rather at the much greater probability of any real event, of anything that would be an event in the general system and upset its balance. The balance of terror is the terror of balance. Deterrence is not a strategy. It circulates and is exchanged between nuclear protagonists, exactly as is international capital in the orbital zone of monetary speculation, whose fluctuations suffice the control to control all global exchanges. Thus, the money of destruction, without any reference to real destruction, any more than floating capital has a real referent of production that circulates in nuclear orbit, suffices to control all the violence and potential conflicts around the world. What is hatched in the shadow of this mechanism with the pretext of a maximal objective threat, and thanks to Damocles' nuclear sword, is the perfection of the best system of control that has ever existed, and the progressive satellization of the whole planet through this hypermodel of security. The same goes for peaceful nuclear power stations. Pacification does not distinguish between the civil and the military. Everywhere where irreversible apparatuses of control are elaborated, everywhere where the notion of security becomes omnipotent, everywhere where the norm replaces the old arsenal of laws and violence, including war, it is the system of deterrence that grows, and around it grows the historical, social, and political desert. A gigantic involution that makes every conflict, every finality, every confrontation, contract in proportion to this blackmail that interrupts, neutralizes, freezes them all. No longer can any revolt, any story be deployed according to its own logic because it risks annihilation. No strategy is possible any longer, and escalation is only a puerile game given over to the military. The political stake is dead. Only simulacra of conflicts and carefully circumscribed stakes remain. The space race played exactly the same role as nuclear escalation. This is why the space program was so easily able to replace it in the 1960s. Kennedy, Khrushchev, or to develop concurrently as a form of peaceful coexistence. Because what, ultimately, is the function of the space program, of the conquest of the moon, of the launching of satellites, if not the institution of a model of universal gravitation, of satellization of which the lunar module is the perfect embryo, programmed microcosm, where nothing can be left to chance, trajectory, energy, calculation, physiology, psychology, environment, nothing can be left to contingencies. This is the total universe of the norm. The law no longer exists. It is the operational immanence of every detail that is law, a universe purged of all threat of meaning, in a state of asepsis and weightlessness. It is the very perfection that is fascinating. The the exaltation of the crowds was not a response to the event of riding on the moon or of sending a man into space. This would be, rather, the fulfillment of an earlier dream. Rather, we are dumbfounded by the perfection of the programming and the technical manipulation, by the imminent wonder of the programmed unfolding of events, fascination with the maximal norm and the mastery of probability, vertigo of the model, which unites with the model of death, but without fear or drive. Because if the law, with its aura of transgression, if order, with its aura of violence, still taps a perverse imaginary, the norm fixes, fascinates, stupefies, and makes every imaginary involute. One no longer fantasizes about the minutiae of a program, just watching it produce vertigo, the vertigo of a world without flaws. Now, it is the same model of programmatic infallibility, of maximum security and deterrence that today controls the spread of the social. There lies the true nuclear fallout. The meticulous operation of technology serves as a model for the meticulous operation of the social. Here as well, nothing will be left to chance. Moreover, this is the essence of socialization, which began centuries ago, but which has now entered its accelerated phase toward a limit that one believed would be explosive, revolution, but which for the moment is translated by an inverse, implosive, irreversible process, the generalized deterrence of chance, of accident, of transversatility, of finality, of contradiction, rupture, or complexity in a sociality illuminated by the norm, doomed to the descriptive transparency of mechanisms of information. In fact, the spatial and nuclear models do not have their own ends. Neither does the discovery of the moon nor military and strategic superiority. Their truth is to be the models of simulation, the model vectors of a system of planetary control, where even the superpowers of this scenario are not free. The whole world is satelitized. Resist the evidence in satelitization. He who is satelitized is not who one might think. Through the orbital inscription of a spatial object, it is the planet Earth that becomes a satellite. It is the terrestrial principle of reality that becomes eccentric, hyperreal, and insignificant. Through the orbital instantiation, instantiate, instantiation of a system of control like peaceful coexistence. All the terrestrial microsystems are satellized and lose their autonomy. All energy, all events are absorbed by the eccentric gravitation. Everything condenses and implodes toward the only micro model of control, the orbital satellite. As conversely, in the other, biological dimension, everything converges and implodes on the molecular micro model of the genetic code. Between the two, in this forking of the nuclear and the genetic, in the simultaneous assumption of the two fundamental codes of deterrence, every principle of meaning is absorbed. Every deployment of the real is impossible. The simultaneity of two events in the month of July 1975 illustrated this in a striking manner. The link up in space of the two American and Soviet super satellites, apotheosis of peaceful coexistence, the suppression by the Chinese of ideogrammatic writing and conversion to the Roman alphabet. The latter signifies the orbital instantiation of an abstract and modelized system of signs, into whose orbit all the once unique forms of style and writing will be reabsorbed. The satelitization of language, the means for the Chinese to enter the system of peaceful coexistence, which is inscribed in their heavens at precisely the same time by the link up of the two satellites. Orbital flight of the big two, neutralization and homogenization of everyone else on Earth. Yet, despite this deterrence by the orbital power, the nuclear or molecular code, events continue at ground level. Misfortunes are even more numerous, given the global process of the contiguity and simultaneity of data. But subtly, they no longer have any meaning. They are no longer anything but the duplex effect of simulation at the summit. The best example can only be that of the war in Vietnam, because it took place at the intersection of a maximum historical and revolutionary stake, and of the installation of this deterrent authority. What meaning did this war have? And wasn't its unfolding a means of sealing the end of history in the decisive and culminating historic event of our era? Why did this war, so hard, so long, so ferocious, vanish from one day to the next as if by magic? Why did this American defeat, the largest reversal in the history of the USA, have no internal repercussions in America? If it had really signified the failure of the planetary strategy of the United States, it would necessarily have completely disrupted its internal balance and the American political system. Nothing of the sort occurred. Something else, then, took place. This war, at bottom, was nothing but a crucial episode of peaceful coexistence. It marked the arrival of China to peaceful coexistence, the non intervention of China obtained and secured after many years. China's apprenticeship to a global modus vivendi, the shift from a global strategy of revolution to one of shared forces and empires, the transition from a radical alternative to political alternation in a system now essentially regulated, the normalization of Peking Washington relations. This was what was at stake in the war in Vietnam. And in this sense, the USA pulled out of Vietnam but won the war. And the war ended spontaneously when the objective was achieved. That is why it was de escalated, demobilized so easily. This same reduction of forces can be seen on the field. The war lasted as long as elements irreducibly to a healthy politics and discipline of power, even a communist one, remain unliquidated. When at last the war had passed into the hands of regular troops in the North and escaped that of the resistance, the war could stop. It had attained its objective. The stake is thus that of a political relay. As soon as the Vietnamese had proved that they were no longer the carriers of an unpredictable subversion, one could let them take over. That theirs is a communist order is not serious in the end. It had proved itself it could be trusted. It is even more effective than capitalism is in the liquidation of savage and archaic pre capitalist structures. Same scenario in the Algerian War. The other aspect of this war and of all wars today, being behind the armed violence, the murderous antagonism of the adversaries, which seems a matter of life and death, which is played out as such, or else one could never send people to get themselves skilled in this kind of thing. Behind this simulacrum of fighting to the death and of ruthless global stakes, the two adversaries are fundamentally in solidarity against something else, unnamed, never spoken, but whose objective outcome in war, with the equal complicity of the two adversaries, is total liquidation, tribal, communitarian, pre capitalist structures, every form of exchange, of language, of symbolic organization. That is what must be abolished. That is the object of murder and war. And war itself, in its immense, spectacular death apparatus, is nothing but the medium of this process of the terrorist rationalization of the social, the murder on which sociality will be founded whatever its allegiance, communist or capitalist. Today, complicity or division of labor between two adversaries, who may even consent to enormous sacrifices for it, for the very end of reshaping and domesticating social relations. The North Vietnamese were advised to countenance a scenario for liquidating the American presence in the course of which, of course, one must save face. This scenario, the extremely harsh bombardment of Hanoi, their untenable character must not conceal the fact that they were nothing but a simulacrum to enable the Vietnamese to seem a countenance, a compromise, and for Nixon to make the Americans swallow the withdrawal of their troops. The game was already won. Nothing was objectively at stake but the verisimilitude of the final montage. The moralists of war, the holders of high wartime values should not be too discouraged. The war is no less atrocious for being only a simulacrum. The flesh suffers just the same, and the dead and former combatants are worth the same as in other wars. This objective is always fulfilled, just like that of the charting of territories and of disciplinary sociality. What no longer exists is the adversity of the adversaries, the reality of antagonistic causes, the ideological seriousness of war, and also the reality of victory or defeat. War being a process that triumphs well beyond these appearances. In any case, the pacification or the deterrence that dominates us today is beyond war and peace. It is that at every moment, war and peace are equivalent. War is peace, said Orwell. There also, the two differential poles implode into each other or recycle one another, a simultaneity of contradictions that is at once the parody and the end of every dialectic. Thus, one can completely miss the truth of a war, namely, that it was finished well before it started, that there was an end to war at the heart of the war itself, and that perhaps it never started. Many other events, the oil crisis, etc., never started, never existed, except as artificial occurrences, abstract ersatz, and as artifacts of history, catastrophes, and crises, destined to maintain a historical investment under hypnosis. The media and the official news service are only there to maintain the illusion of an actuality, of the reality of the stakes, of the objectivity of facts. All the events are to be read backward, or one becomes aware. As with the communists in power in Italy, the retro, posthumous rediscovery of the gulags and Soviet dissidents, like the almost contemporary discovery by a moribund ethnology of the lost difference of savages, that all these things arrived too late, with a history of delay, a spiral of delay, that they long ago exhausted their meaning and only live from an artificial effervescence of signs, that all those events succeed each other without logic, in the most contradictory, complete equivalence, in a profound indifference to their consequences. But this is because there are none. They exhaust themselves in their spectacular promotion. All newsreel footage thus gives the sinister impression of quiche, of retro and porno at the same time. Doubtless everyone knows this, and no one really accepts it. The reality of simulation is unbearable, crueler than R. Todd's theater of cruelty, which was still an attempt to create a dramaturgy of life, the last gasp of an ideality of the body, of blood, of violence, in a system that was already taking it away, toward a reabsorption of all the stakes without a trace of blood. For us, the trick has been played. All dramaturgy and even all real writing of cruelty has disappeared. Simulation is the master, and we only have a right to the retro, to the phantom, parodic rehabilitation of all lost referentials. Everything still unfolds around us in the cold light of deterrence, including our Todd, who has the right, like everything else, to his revival, to a second existence as the referential of cruelty. This is why nuclear proliferation does not increase the risk of either an atomic clash or an accident, save in the interval, save in the interval when the young powers could be tempted to make a non-deterrent real use of it, as the Americans did in Hiroshima. But precisely only they had a right to this use value of the bomb. All of those who have acquired it since will be deterred from using it by the very fact of possessing it. Entry into the atomic club, so prettily named, very quickly effaces, as unionization does in the working world, any inclination toward violent intervention. Responsibility, control, censure, self deterrence always grow more rapidly than the forces or the weapons at our disposal. This is the secret of the social order. Thus, the very possibility of paralyzing a whole country by flicking a switch makes it so that the electrical engineers will never use this weapon. The whole myth of the total and revolutionary strike crumbles at the very moment when the means are available. But alas, precisely because those means are available, therein lies the whole process of deterrence. It is thus perfectly probable that one day we will see nuclear powers export atomic reactors, weapons, and bombs to every latitude. Control by threat will be replaced by the more effective strategy of pacification through the bomb and through the possession of the bomb. The little powers, believing that they are buying their independent striking force, will buy the virus of deterrence, of their own deterrence. The same goes for the atomic reactor that we have already sent them. So many neutron bombs knocking out all historical virulence, all risk of explosion. In this sense, the nuclear everywhere inaugurates an accelerated process of implosion. It freezes everything around it. It absorbs all living energy. The nuclear is at once the culminating point of available energy and the maximization of energy control systems. Lockdown and control increase in direct proportion to, and undoubtedly even faster than, liberating potentialities. This was already the aporia of the modern revolution. It is still the absolute paradox of the nuclear. Energies freeze in their own fire. They deter themselves. One can no longer imagine what project, what power, what strategy, what subject could exist behind this enclosure, this vast saturation of a system by its own forces, now neutralized, unusable, unintelligible, non explosive, except for the possibility of an explosion toward the center, of an implosion where all these energies would be abolished in a catastrophic process. In the literal sense, that is to say, in the sense of a reversion of the whole cycle toward a minimal point, of a reversion of energies toward a minimal threshold. Notes: C.F. Baudrillard, L'Ordre des Simulacres, the Order of Simulacra, in L'Échange, Symbolica, et la Mort, Symbolic Exchange and Death, Paris, Gallimard, 1976. 2. A discourse that is itself not susceptible to being resolved in transference. It is the entanglement of these two discourses that renders psychoanalysis interminable. 3. C.F.M. Perinola. Let's see how many we got. All right, I'll read through them. Icones, visions, simulacras. Icons, vision, simulacra, 39. 4. This does not necessarily result in despairing of meaning, but just as much in the improvisation of meaning, of non-meaning, of many simultaneous meanings that destroy each other. Taken together, the energy crisis and the ecological mise en scène are themselves a disaster movie in the same style and with the same value as those that currently comprise the golden days of Hollywood. It is useless to laboriously interpret these films in terms of their relation to an objective social crisis or even to an objective phantasm of disaster. It is, in another sense, that it might be said that it is the social itself that, in contemporary discourse, is organized along the lines of a disaster movie script. C.F. M. Macarius, La Stratégie de la Catastrophe, The Strategy of Disaster, 115. 6. To this flagging investment and in work corresponds a parallel decline in the investment in consumption. Goodbye to use value or to prestige of the automobile. Goodbye amorous discourses that neatly oppose the object of enjoyment to the object of work. Another discourse takes hold that is a discourse of work on the object of consumption, aiming for an active, constraining, Puritan reinvestment. Use less gas. Watch out for your safety. You've gone over the speed limit, etc., to which the characteristics of automobiles pretend to adapt. Rediscovering the stake through the transposition of these two poles. Work becomes the object of need. The car becomes the object of work. There is no better proof of the lack of differentiation among all the stakes. It is through the same slippage between the right to vote and electoral duty that the divestment of the political sphere is signaled. The medium message confusion is certainly a corollary of that between the sender and the receiver, thus sealing the disappearance of all dual polar structures that formed the discursive organization of language, of all determined articulation of meaning reflecting Jacobson's famous grid of functions. That discourse circulates is is to be taken literally. That is, it no longer goes from one point to another, but it traverses a cycle that, without distinction, includes the position of transmitter and receiver, now unlocatable as such. Thus, there is no instance of power, no instance of transmission. Power is something that circulates and whose source can no longer be located. A cycle in which the positions of the dominator and the dominated are exchanged in an endless reversion that is also the end of power in its classical definition. The circularization of power, of knowledge, of discourse puts an end to any localization of instances and poles. In the psychoanalytic interpretation itself, the power of interpreter does not come from any outside instance, but from the interpreted himself. This changes everything, but one can always ask of the traditional holders of power where they get their power from. Who made you, Duke? The king. Who made you king? God. Only God no longer answers. But to the question, who made you a psychoanalyst? The analyst can well reply, you. This is expressed by an inverse simulation, the passage from the analyzed to the analysand, from passive to active, which simply describes the spiraling effect of the shifting of poles, the effect of circularity in which power is lost, is dissolved, is resolved in perfect manipulation. It is no longer of the order of directive power and of the gaze, but of the order of tactility and commutation. See also the state, family, circularity, assured by the fluctuation of metastic regulation of images of the social and the private. J. Donzelot, La Police des Amiles, the policing of families. Impossible now to pose the famous question, from what position do you speak? How do you know? From where do you get your power? Without hearing the immediate response. But it is of you, from you, that I speak. Meaning, it is you who are speaking. You who know. You who are the power. Gigantic circumlocution of the spoken word, which is equal to a blackmail with no end, to a deterrence that cannot be appealed of the subject presumed to speak, leaving him without a reply, because to the question that he poses, one ineluctably replies. One ineluctably replies, but you are the answer, or your question is already an answer, etc. The whole strangulatory sophistication of intercepting speech, of the forced confession, is the guise of freedom of expression, of trapping the subject in his own interrogation, of the procession of the reply to the question. All the violence of interpretation lies there, as well as that of the conscious or unconscious management of the spoken word. Herole. This simulacrum of the inversion or the involution of poles, this clever subterfuge, which is the secret of the whole discourse of manipulation, and thus, today, in every domain, the secret of any new power in the erasure of the scene of power, in the assumption of all words from which has resulted this fantastic silent majority characteristic of our time. All of this started without a doubt in the political sphere with the democratic simulacrum, which today is the substitution for the power of God, with the power of the people as the source of power, and of power as emanation with the power as representation. Anti-Copernican revolution, no transcendental instance either of the sun or of the luminous sources of power and knowledge. Everything comes from the people and everything returns to them. It is with this magnificent recycling that the universal simulacrum of manipulation, from the scenario of mass suffrage to the present day phantoms of opinion polls, begins to be put in place. 8. PPEP is an acronym for smallest possible gap, or plus petit écart possible, trans. 9. Paradox. All bombs are clean. Their only pollution is the system of security and of control they radiate, as long as they don't explode. And that concludes chapter 1. On our next episode, we'll be coming to chapter 2, history, a retro scenario. This is some powerful material, y'all. Stick with us. All right, we're gonna keep coming at you with each episode with Simulacra Simulation. Yeah. Yep, it's exactly what Trey said. Simulacra Simulation on the MasterMind Library by Jean Baudrillard. And it's some powerful material, y'all. Taking a look at the real, taking a look at the dream, taking a look at the dream within the dream. All right, so stick with us. Grab the book, download it from the link in the description. In this video, we got the MasterMind Library link up there. Go on in there and grab you some books. We got all kinds of different material in there. So grab you something, check it out. Grab you the Simulacra Simulation. Sit down and read it. This is some heavy material, but it helps us to see the real of our reality versus this made up reality. The grocery stores, the hospital, the police stations, the restaurants, and all. This is a made up reality. Right, the actual reality is something different. Right, we can align it with nature. It actually is nature, and then us being embedded in nature in the regular circle of life. You know, so we're about to go into chapter 2 on next episode 102. All right, so thank y'all for being here, and y'all take care and expose your gift.